Okay, everyone. Welcome to panel 6, our last panel for the conference. The title of the panel is Eyes on ISIS and Syria, a legal, humanitarian, and military analysis. Please roll the clip.
The war in Syria is a mess. Assad, who is an Alawite, is fighting the Sunni rebels with the support of the Shiite Iranians and their old-time ally Russia. Saudi Arabia, which is Sunni and the arch-nemesis of Iran, is helping the rebels, and so is Sunni Turkey. The U.S. also wants Assad gone, but can't yet figure out whom to support. Also, the Islamic State, which everybody hates, is fighting Assad, not because they support the rebels, but rather because they want to take over the world. The Kurds, who have been massacred by ISIS because, well, they're not ISIS, are fighting back, hoping to also finally get a state of their own. This is seen as a threat by Turkey, which is claiming to attack ISIS, which everybody hates, but is actually attacking the Kurds. But no one wants to get Turkey too upset, as they're the gateway to millions of refugees who are flooding Europe. You with me so far? Now, even if you are on top of all of this, there are still many legal issues that have been left unanswered. What legal issues surround the war? How do refugees affect military operations? Is ISIS now its own state, constituting portions of eastern Syria and western Iraq?
The Syrian war has had a destabilizing effect on the world, and ISIS has used the refugee crisis as a weapon, both seeking to destabilize Syria's neighbors and using the wave of refugees to camouflage its operations. This panel will discuss the legal issues surrounding the effect of refugees on military operations, as well as the humanitarian issues presented. I'm honored to introduce to you our moderator, Dana Weiss. Dana is a senior journalist at Israel's Channel 2. She is currently the anchor and chief correspondent for Channel 2's primetime Saturday night news. She was also a co-host of critical late-night news magazine Punchline and anchored special coverage of Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, the Second Lebanon War in 2007, and the more recent Gaza wars in 2008 and 2012. Please welcome Ms. Dana Weiss.
Thank you, Rachel, for this kind introduction, and thank you all for being here and for letting me be part of this most needed and interested conference. I understand that you've had a wonderful day today, and this is the closing panel, so bear with us because we have great speakers on stage and huge issues to deal with. And I think that we saw in the clip everything was right except the music, because there's nothing funny about the ordeal this region is going through. There are a lot of human beings behind those guns and weapons, and I think we should all remember that, and we will touch upon that in our panel. So it's almost a cliche to say that we are living in a new Middle East, far from the peaceful one some in Israel talked about 2 decades ago. And it's just the same to talk about the stunning effect ISIS has on public opinion and on our lives here in the West, and especially in the Middle East, despite their actual size. We will hear from our panelists, but we're talking about no more than 35,000 warriors on pickup trucks. And here we are sitting thousands of kilometers away in Tel Aviv, and there are conferences like this world over. Jerusalem, sorry. I actually worked in this hotel when I was a student, so I was born and raised not far from here, so my heart is still in Jerusalem. Anyway, there are conferences like this all over the world because of this organization, yet when you look at their actual size, it is a puzzling question. How can so many people affect so few people affect so many people? And of course, even so, the understanding that nothing stays only in the region in this day and age, and in the global world we live in, what happens in Iraq and Homs, of course, affects Paris, Belgium, maybe Orlando, and we'll talk about that. Adding to all of this turmoil and change in the region, the shocking numbers of refugees. It's amazing to learn that almost 45% of Syria's population are now displaced or refugees. Now, these are people like us who, what? Sorry? What? These are people that you can see on TV. They are just normal citizens who all of a sudden found themselves in the midst of war, and they're paying the price. And just yesterday, the UN published a shocking number that today there is a record high number of refugees in the world since the statistics were starting to accumulate. That we're talking about 64 million refugees, and the stunning data is that 24 people are forced to leave their house every minute on the globe. 10 years ago, it was 6 per minute. Just to give you the proportions, and Syria, of course, Syria and Iraq today are Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan are the #1 manufacturers, if you will, of refugees and displacement. So, of course, millions of them seek asylum in the Middle East, and millions also are trying to flee to Europe, and this, of course, has a stunning effect on everything from life, day-to-day life, to policy, to legal affairs, and to, of course, dealing with the aftermath of these events, even if we reach an agreement here in Syria. So how do we deal with all of this? How do we deal with ISIS? What laws do we need to come up with? What laws can we use from the old world? Are we indeed talking about a new Middle East, a new world order? We have great panelists on stage, and I think we'll have a thrilling and enlightening discussion, and these will be the ground rules, if you may. I will introduce each speaker, and we'll give them 5 to 8 minutes to give their presentation, but please try and keep the time, and then we will open up to questions, and I understand there will be questions from the audience. And hecklers, please, if you may. This is the last session, so I guess you had your chance throughout the day, so we can start. So I would like to start with Professor Avi Bell, who is a professor of law at the University of San Diego School of Law and Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law. He is a widely cited expert on property law, especially government taking of property, international law, the laws of war, and economic analysis of law. He received his JD from the University of Chicago and an SAG from Harvard, and previously clerked for Justice Michel Cheshin on the Supreme Court of Israel. So, Professor Bell, we would like to hear from you, if you could lay the grounds from a legal perspective. Are we indeed looking into a whole different set of rules? Do we need a new law book?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. This is a dismal topic to talk about, as you said. This is the first great conflict of the 21st century. We're looking already at 250,000 dead and some 11 million people displaced from their homes, and there's no end in sight. Now, well, I did want to address the question of what this tells us about the laws of war, because our time is so brief. If I can, I'm just going to make 4 brief observations about the situation and 4 brief observations about the law itself. Now, one of the most interesting things about this conflict is, despite the fact that there are hundreds, literally hundreds of different groups that are fighting within this war, I've even seen estimates of as many as 1,000, I'm not aware of any side, not a single one, that obeys the laws of war. They're all violating the most basic rules. They're targeting civilians as such. The sides are using chemical weapons, other forbidden weaponry. We're even seeing horrible practices like using rape as a weapon of war, slavery. Prisoners of war are being murdered. There's torture. Children are being used as combatants, and of course, in the case of Daesh, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, they're conducting fairly openly a campaign of genocide. Now, this is unfortunately not unusual to be seeing widespread violations of the laws of war. Now, there are some, in general, what we tend to see in conflicts in the world is that there are those who obey and those who do not. Those who obey tend to be the Western democracies. Those who do not obey is everyone else. There are some Western democracies that are peripherally involved in the conflict, primarily at this point the United States, the UK, and some other forces. They are encountering legal questions, such as the legal right to intervene when they haven't been directly attacked by the state of Syria, and what sorts of targeting practices they can use when they're fighting terrorist organizations like ISIS. May they target their economic capacity? Now, these legal questions are being seriously addressed. They're being seriously addressed generally in favor of the policies that the West wants to pursue, and logically so, and in sharp contrast to the way these same organizations in the West and countries in the West and actors in the West answer these questions when it comes to Israel, which brings me to another important observation about this conflict. What we can see is that not only are there two groups, those who obey the law and those who do not obey the law. Among the groups that obey the law, there are apparently two standards of law. There's one for Israel and there's one for everyone else. And so the one for everyone else is being followed reasonably well by those actors who actually follow it. Right? So confronted with the question of whether Western countries can attack economic targets, the answer is, of course, yes. When it comes to ISIS, they have to take away the economic capacity of ISIS to carry on its horrific practices. The same question was asked about Israel, of course, when it was fighting Hezbollah and Hamas, and the same people who were saying yes then, yes now, were saying no then, and I guarantee you when Israel comes to fighting again, they'll flip and remember the Israel rule. The Israel rule is that what is permitted for Western democracies is forbidden to Israel. Now, there's another circle of this, which is questions of enforcement. There's no direct means of enforcing international law of war in this conflict, but there are all sorts of indirect ways. In fact, there are even duties on certain parties to enforce rules. There are treaties regarding laws of terrorism requiring taking steps against terrorist organizations, requiring the prosecution of war crimes, requiring taking steps to prevent genocide. This is one of the reasons that everybody was dancing around the word of genocide for so long, because nobody wanted to admit that they were violating their legal duties to prevent it. But none of these things are happening. These rules of prevention and enforcement are not being followed, even by the Western democracies that do obey the rules of war. And this is another theme that we have, that is not all law is obeyed. So what does this tell us about the state of...
So Avi, I wanted to ask you at this point, do you think that if this is the way that there's one side who's playing by the rules, which are obviously not rules that are adequate for the situation, and another side allows themselves to do whatever they want and they're very cruel, what does the West have to make of it? Do they have to say, okay, we put the laws aside and we play just as our enemies, or can we come up with a new set of rules? In other words, is the fact that the West is trying to obey to some kind of rules of war hurting them in their battle against ISIS?
So where I actually wanted to conclude is I think that's the wrong question. And the reason it's the wrong question is there isn't very much international law.
You see, you're not a politician, because when politicians want to say something, they say that's a very good question, but the real question is, and then...
Okay.
And they don't aggravate the moderator because they know the next question is going to come. So, but you're not a politician, obviously. Thank you for that.
That's a wonderful question, and the... I used to say that nobody's ever accused me of being a diplomat, and I guess nobody's ever accused me of being a politician either. I hope that's a good thing. Yeah, as it turns out, the international laws of war are much thinner than we think they are. Now, something that Jeff Korn said in the last panel I think is correct. We have standards of fighting because it is morally important to have these things. We do not want to be as they are and wantonly slaughter people or carry out systematic rape and genocide as a part of a campaign of slaughter against the innocent. This is not the way we do things. But let's understand that when we're talking about international law, there's a standard way of understanding what customary international law is. It's based on what states actually do. And states are not actually doing these things. There's very few people that actually do these. We should look at ourselves as doing these things not because law requires, but because it is right. And this is important because when we think about how are we to try to spread these moral standards, are we going to spread them by thickening these treaties that are already disobeyed by everybody? Are we going to strengthen them by strengthening institutions that have already created three standards, basically? A group that never obeys anything and they're okay, a group that obeys things for the most part, but not when it comes to enforcement, and then there's this third standard which applies only to Israel. Is that really what we want to have? Do we want to strengthen these institutions? I think we do not. I mean, ultimately, what we hope to do, what the laws of war were set up to do, is to try to reduce human suffering. And I think that if we look at the way they're playing out in the world, we have to admit that they have been a dismal failure.
Okay, so we will get back to you to understand if they're a failure or whatnot, but let's move on to Dr. Mordechai KEDAR, who is an Israeli scholar of Arabic literature and a lecturer at the Bar-Ilan University, and I think there is no one in the crowd or in Israel who doesn't follow or read Mordechai's analysis and academic writings. He's an expert on the Israeli Arab population, and he served for 25 years at the IDF military intelligence, where he specialized in Islamic groups. So, Dr. KEDAR, I just want to start with a very short question. Were you personally surprised by the phenomena of ISIS after being so after investing so many years in research? Is it something that managed to surprise you, the magnitude of their influence, their ruthlessness, their cruelty?
Well, not at all. First of all, because I will relate to the name ISIS, which should be altered, but the phenomenon of the Islamic State is, you know, it's today, but we had the same thing like almost every century since Islam came to the world. First of all, the Islam at the beginning did the same thing. The first Muslims, when they conquered this part of the world in the 7th century, they beheaded people, they burned people, they drowned people to death, they destroyed idols of infidels, and they sold the daughters of the infidels to slavery. So this time, what they do today is actually they follow the footsteps of their forefathers of the 7th century. Then it happened again in the 8th century when they went to what today Pakistan is, the same behavior. You saw it in Spain, you saw it in many places. Even Salah ad-Din, who conquered this country, the land of Israel, from the Crusaders in the end of the 12th century, he behaved the same. He was a warlord, just like the Baghdadi of today. So the Islamic culture bore every century, more or less, something which looked more or less like the Islamic State. So nobody who is aware of the Islamic history should be surprised, because the precedents which they follow these days are actually engraved in the books of history of Islam. So this is the first thing. However, I think that we have to notice some very important things when it comes especially to law and definitions. First of all, everybody talks about ISIS. Let me give you some news. For 2 years already, there is no such a thing. ISIS means Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They changed their name exactly 2 years ago in June 2014 by omitting the second IS, means Iraq and Syria, and today, no, 2 years already, their name is Islamic State, period. So if we want to really to relate to the reality, we cannot give them names which they don't call themselves. So their name is IS or Islamic State. This is one thing. Secondly, they are not an organization anymore. They are a state. Because the big difference between an organization and a state is that an organization is a group of people with an agenda. Let's put it roughly. While a state is a group of people with agenda and a territory. And they have a giant territory. Okay, until 2 months ago, the territory which they controlled was like 20 times the size of Israel. Today, it's 15 times. Yet, significant. So to say that they are only an organization, implying that they don't have a territory because they are an organization, like Shurat HaDin. Shurat HaDin is an organization. They don't have a territory yet. But no, but the Islamic State, they do have a giant territory, and they control something like 10 million people. So this is a state, whether we like it or not. So to call it, just like the BBC, the organization which names itself the Islamic State. That's how the BBC are talking, because the Muslims in Britain do not like the name Islamic State because implicitly they are connected to it because they are Muslims. So they forced, more or less, the BBC to call this state the organization which calls itself the Islamic State. However, a spade should be named a spade. And this is the Islamic State. So everything, and I think some...
Is there any logic in calling Syria Syria? Referring to Syria
This is the third
Syria?
point. Well, you must have read what I wrote.
No, I'm trying very hard not to get another remark
let me
like
tell you something.
Professor Bell.
Let me tell you a secret about Dana Weiss. 15 years ago, she came to cover the testimony which Sheikh Raed Salah gave in the Supreme Court in the investigating committee. And she was the only one in the audience, and I was the second one. Okay? So we both together. And she is a real journalist. She doesn't read in the papers what others write. She goes by herself. And this is Dana.
Thank you.
But Syria is not a state anymore. To continue to talk about Syria as a state is just like to talk about Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because these states do not exist anymore. They were shattered to pieces, divided to other countries. Yugoslavia was divided, or Soviet Union. Yugoslavia, there are 6 or 7 countries on the ruins of Yugoslavia, 10 states on the ruins of the Soviet Union, and who knows how many states on the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The same thing about Syria. Today there is a Kurdish district in the north, and believe me, the Kurds will never come again under the yoke of the Arabs of Syria. Forget it. So, first of all, this will not happen again. Secondly, the Alawis, if they want to keep their heads connected to their shoulders, they will have to establish their own state. Because what happened today is that are targeted, especially in this area of their body. So this is why I'm not trying to be funny, because this is the reality, the sad reality of what we see today with horror in this region. However, another definition which we have to change are the Syrian refugees. And here, there are enough people who know about law much more than me. Refugee, who should be treated as a refugee, is somebody who is fleeing from a war zone. However, every one of those refugees who come to Europe today from Turkey, they are not running from a war zone. They are running away from Turkey. Turkey is a state, and as much as I know, the first country, stable country, which a refugee puts his foot on should absorb him. This country cannot kick him away, as much as I am aware of rules of these things. Maybe I'm mistaken, I don't know. But those who come from Turkey are not coming for a war zone. Why the heck should Europe accept people who come from Turkey to Europe without visas, without any arrangement? And because the Turks succeed to do it, so they can do it. I think that European countries should have called Turkey to order when they first came from Turkey to Europe. And unfortunately, many of those who drowned in the sea, because of they take these little ships which cannot cross the seas, only because the world did not do anything against Turkey when Turkey started to send people who were once refugees who came from Syria to Turkey, and they sent them away to Europe. I think that Turkey should pay for the sin which Turkey did to those people who were sent away, although Turkey is not a failing state, is not a war zone. This is one thing about Turkey, but there are many other responsible people or states. Qatar is fully responsible for what started as the Arab Spring and turned to be the Islamic winter or the Arab disaster, call it the name you like. Saudi Arabia, which funds many of those rebels who caused the problems in Syria. Turkey, which was the gateway for many of the jihadists who came from all over the world, Israel included, in order to go to the Islamic State and to devastate the people. I don't remember those countries being dragged to any tribunal in the world to give an account to what they did to contribute to the atrocities in Syria, and Iran above everyone, who sends its troops. Although Iran is not allowed to send any soldier out of Iran because of the orders from the Security Council of the United Nations, they export money, they export weapons, ammunition, terrorists, everything which they are not allowed to send from Iran. Who called them to order? No, the world goes to sign agreements with them, which will allow them having more money and send more money in order to spread more terror and more death in more places in the world, Yemen included.
Yes, Dr. KEDAR, we'll get back to you because it's
Yeah.
interesting also to understand what is the actual implications of the fact that this is a different region, but we'll get back to you because and I wanted to go to you, General, but we'll go first to MEYER HABIB because we mentioned the refugees, and of course, Europe is today feeling the outcome of these events, these 5 past years of civil war in what used to be called Syria. And even today we had a reminder in Brussels where there was an alert about a terrorist, not to mention the horrendous attacks in Paris and in Brussels earlier on this year. So MEYER HABIB, I'll just let you know, he's our guest from France. He's a member of the French National Embassy of the UDI party. And by the way, he's the first observant Jew ever elected to the French National Assembly. He is a member of the Center-Right Party and serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee and is a well-known figure here in Israel and a dear friend. Mr. HABIB, so when you look at these past years and you look about Europe's dealing with the refugees, does it get the case? Does it understand what's on stake here?
Thank you, Dana. I want first of all to tell that I'm not used to speaking English, and I want you to forgive me by not so extraordinary English. It should be much more easier, naturally, in French or in Hebrew. So I will try to do it in English anyway.
If you want to do Hebrew, I can translate.
No, that's okay. I will continue in English.
Okay.
No, because we are going to save time, you know.
I'm not lucky
time.
today. It's not working for me.
No, what I want... as you introduced myself, I'm a member of parliament. I'm very involved in the parliament question of against terrorism. And just now, in January 16, I was nominated the vice president of a special commission of inquiry on the means implemented by the states since January 2015 in the fight against terror. And we are going to give a report, which is going to be in the next weeks. It's very important commission. You have to understand that suddenly in 2015 we are 150 persons killed in France by terrorism. We don't used to that for many years. Until we have 3 waves of terror in France. We have. Don't forget that in the early 70s, 80s, sorry. We have a ways of when Hezbollah killed 10 of French soldiers in Beirut and hit Paris, killing 10 people in several attacks against civilians. That's the first way. We had a second wave in the middle of 90s during Algeria civil wars. And now we have the third wave, which totally new. It began with soldiers in Montauban and in Jews. In Toulouse, they kill in a school. It's the first time that a Jew has been killed in their school since Shoah period. They begin with children. After they kill journalists again in Charlie, and after, as you know, once again Jews in Hypercacher, and after they decide to kill everybody, and it's quite new, and we are not ready. Unfortunately, France is not ready, Europe is not ready, and unfortunately, I think Diana, that it's only the beginning of this wave.
So do you think, because there are two different problems on stake here. One is the terror, which is driven or inspired by ISIS, and then you have the refugee, because we have to put the fact on the ground that only about 2 or 3 refugees from all these hundreds of thousands was involved directly in terror. So do you see that as two different problems?
It's two different problems. You know, refugee. We have been, as Jew, has been also one day a refugee. So we cannot mix everything together. We have been in Greece with the Commission. We have been in Turkey. By the way, if Turkey wants, they can stop totally the refugee. Erdogan decide now. You have around 30, 50 a day. If he's open, you can have 3,000 a week. Erdogan can decide whatever you want. Greece is a weak country, it's more complicated. But it's more complicated than refugee, Dana. You have to understand that when after Hypercacher on Charlie, we have 30,000 tweets. You know, you remember you have tweet, I am Charlie, right? You have 30,000 tweets, I am Koulibaly, and I am Kouachi. Can you imagine 30, not 3,000, 30,000 people with tweet, I am Kouachi and I am Koulibaly. Look what you were supposed to take 30,000 put in jail, apology to terrorism. That's what happened really. And that's the main problem. You have 2,000 jihadis repertoried, but how many thousand and thousand and thousand are not repertoried? You are going to Tunisia, you are going to Turkey, you are in holiday. You know what happened after there? Every year you have around 40,000 we call fichier S, special, and it's come for, on what is, you, jail, we can speak about jail. You go in jail as a criminal, you go out as a jihadist. It's very problematic today. And unfortunately, France is not ready at all. It's only the beginning. We have something very new.
What should France do?
Last week, for the first time, and I said to one on here, please, we call l'intifada des couteaux, the knife intifada. And I'd always, you know, sometime when the mother has been killed and she was battling like a lion to save her children, Dina, few people for France, it was only, it's not a terrorism attack. It was an attack, but Leumani attack. How do you call that? National and not really terrorism. And I say, please, open the eye. It's going to come in our country. What happened today? Last week, they killed with a knife a couple of policiers.
On Facebook, yes.
With the presence of their children. And it's only the beginning. You have between 6 and 8 million. We cannot, it's forbidden to, with the French law to count exactly people with their religion. But we have between 6 and 8 million Muslims in France. The majority is not at all terrorists, or not jihadists, or not all. But what is very worrying is the phenomenon is going up and not down. The first generation was okay, they was here for working. The children, instead to be more integrated in France, they speak French like me, they become more and more aggressive and more terrorists. So the phenomenon is very problematic. So to answer to your question, and we are not ready to this war. We are not ready in intelligence. We are not ready in security. I ask the commission to come in Israel to learn from Israel. They know they are 70 years battling terrorism. 3 hours in Bataclan, 3 hours, and I see exactly the same in Orlando. It takes also 3 hours. It's not une prise d'otage, comment on dit, hijacking,
Hijack.
hijacking. When you have hijacking, okay, you can have time, bring special force and so on.
Hostages.
Now it's a massacre. And you have to know that people in Bataclan, in the first 15 minutes, he killed 100 people. You don't have time to call special units or to call and so on, to go and so on. Every minute is very important. Like, by the way, in Orlando, the Israeli doctrine is to go to the contact, l'Artor Bemaga, to maximum, in the maximum of vitesse. Today, Europe, unfortunately, is not ready. Is not ready about all. Now we have also to change the legislation. That's also a very important point. The legislation is not ready because we are more. Nous sommes en état d'urgence. Today we are state of urgence. You know, I prepare something in English now, but I forget everything. I try to.
We see it comes from the bottom of your heart. So these are things that are.
It's a little bit more complicated. What, you know, human right is very important. And that's true that sometimes terrorists use the fact that we are very, the human right are very important for all of us. And they use that we have some holes in the law. So now we try 3 times, we change the law, we change the law, we change the law, in order to adapt our system to the new way of terrorism. It's not easy, it's very complicated, it's taking a lot of time. We have only to understand that nobody is born terrorist, nobody is born jihadist, nobody is born anti-Semitic. The education is very, very, very important. And we have to have, because now we are going only emergency things to try to stop, but we have to be proactive and not only reactive. That's the main problem. The terrorists cannot be developed if you don't have some state which support, finance, and give all the logistics to the terrorism. They people will know that. Like Iran, you know, I remember Dana last war. I was with Elysée.
You have to talk to the mic, and I will get back to you. So this is the last point for this round.
Yeah. Well, no, what I want to remember, I remember I was in Élysée, Palais de l'Élysée. It was in 27th of August 2013. And the President Hollande, it was la conférence des ambassadeurs. All the ambassadors of France, all on the member of parliament in charge of abroad, invited in special 3 days in Élysée. And the President Hollande take me on the side. I'm not in his party, but we have a quite good relationship. He's telling me, you know, we are going to attack Syria in the next day. Don't say that, but now I spoke with Obama, and we are going to, in the next day, to attack Syria, very targeting very special targets, but we take the decision. You know what happened after that? Nothing happened, because a few weeks later, I met him. I said, what happened? He said, you know what happened? We decide with President Obama. But after we discussed hours and hours, at the end of the story, the President Obama take, okay, we are agree, but I have only to ask to the Congress to have the permission to do that. At the end of the story, after they decide on who knows in that period, 3 years ago, Daesh, that ISIS was nothing, you know, Al-Qaeda, you know, something else, nothing. When the world is so weak, so weak. So that's the reason that today we let them to grow, and grow, and we have to have very different. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a good point to address our next speaker, our special guest, Brigadier General Kenneth Watkin, who served 33 years in the Canadian Forces, and for 4 years during his service, he worked as the Judge Advocate General, the Senior Military Legal Advisor, and Superintendent of the Military Justice System. As a military legal officer, he worked in a variety of military justice and general legal advisory positions. From 1995 until 2005, he was government consultant in various international investigations, inquiries arising from the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, and appeared in the capacity before the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and for Arusha, Tanzania. And I want to, first of all, thank you for making the effort and the log trip and coming here to join us in this conference. So please give him a round of applause. It's not easy to come these days, and no one told you it's going to be so hot, so you're here with the suit. I wanted to ask you, does indeed the international community understand what it's facing? Is the reaction appropriate, and is the hesitation of the international community in some sense inappropriate to what might seem as an existential threat to the Western values?
Well, Dana, that's an excellent question, because that's what I was going to talk about. So that's very good. Could you put up the slide, please? Shalom, it's wonderful to be back in Jerusalem. I met Nitzana yesterday for the first time, and I must say I didn't know we had something in common. As you found out yesterday, she's the mother of triplets, and I am one of triplets.
Oh.
And I must say condolences to Nitzana. I know what we did to my mother, so in any event. Look, I want to talk about values, and there's been much talked about values. And this slide I just put up is a recent study that's come out from the U.S. Looking from a North American perspective and a European perspective, it reports on the challenges of facing really not just the Islamic State, but Salafi jihadism altogether. And one of the things I want to challenge is just the basis of some of the wording in this panel about refugees being a weapon. They are not. They are victims. And it's heartening to hear the panelists talk about the humanity of refugees. I actually retired in 2010, and I have had personal experience with Syrian refugees. My wife and I were part of a church group that sponsored Syrian refugees who arrived. This family of 6 arrived in the middle of Canada in the winter in December with a bag of documents, the clothes on their back, to start a new life. It certainly wasn't, for them, it was a wonderful opportunity to escape violence. It was to them something I imagine they thought would never happen. This is a wonderful family, and it just brings home deeply, deeply the humanity, and what we need to avoid doing is objectifying the victims. I just put that out in terms of the notion of banning people because they're part of a group, let's say Muslims, of which we've heard much. When we start to do that, we're starting to lose, because this is a battle of values. Canada is taking 25,000 refugees. So far, it's planning to take another 25,000. But look, this is in many ways a drop in the bucket. We are a blessed country. We're geographically blessed. We have great neighbors, great resources, and we have a moat around us, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic Ocean. So, but Canada also has not always had this view. And certainly up to and during World War II, we were not friendly to Jewish refugees coming to Canada. Since that time, as we heard this morning from Erwin Kotler, it's become part of our DNA in order to notion to bring refugees in. We brought 1.2 million. We also have experience with terrorism. I'm going to pass over that because of the limited time. It's different than Israel's. It's different in some ways than Europe. It's also the same in many ways. And the concern that I have is not so much people, when the refugee stream coming to Canada, it's the concern of young men mostly being radicalized within Canada and the threat that they pose and coming back from the battlefield and the potential threat that they have. And this is much more of a domestic societal issue within Canada itself and why they don't have hope in the society in which they live. Canada is no stranger to armed conflict, but it's a different notion of armed conflict than, let's say, the Israeli experience. So one of the things I try to talk about when I used to talk to my Israeli colleagues is that our experience is outside of Canada. We go to fight. And there was much yesterday said about the United Nations, and certainly there is much to criticize, and they should be held accountable for the things that you believe are unfair. That said, there's a reason why the United Nations and human rights, international human rights, was created at the end of Second World War. states are capable of incredible violence and cruelty, as you know all too well. 50 million people killed in World War II, 6 million killed in a Holocaust, and is that what's created the framework in which to try to restrain states and try to restrain violence? One of the challenges in all this is the violence is now internal to states. Being outside of the area, let's say in Canada, and trying to determine and convince the Canadian people that they need to send their sons and daughters overseas to fight is a challenge, to a large extent, a challenge of values. So I know how emotional it is for Israelis to lose their young sons and daughters in armed conflict. Imagine you're a Canadian mother or father, and you're thinking of sending your son and daughter to a country on the other side of the world which you may not have heard of and you don't know where it is on the map. We lost 158 Canadians killed in Afghanistan over a 10-year involvement in an armed conflict, a vicious insurgency, and over 2,000 wounded. But Canada went as part of a global community and a coalition, in part to fight for values in order to try to restrain that conflict. Part of that values is one of genocide, and I took part in a group in Washington in 2013 that involved NGOs, think tanks, as only Washington seems to do, members of the US government, in order to look at should there be intervention in Syria and what that would look like in order to protect civilians. Because what motivates the international community is to protect civilians. And what does that engage? A particular issue that engages is how do you do that and what are the consequences? And this line in this report I thought was one of the most fascinating because it's one of the ones that applies to all of us. For NGOs, they're struggling with the notion of do they cause casualties and what's the consequences of doing nothing? And states struggle with the same issue. How do we intervene? Which brings us to the question of one of the things states will do is react right away. So an example is in France. After the attacks in November 2015, the horrendous attacks, the reaction of the French government was to get engaged more in the air campaign. And one of the problems and one of the challenges that there's been over the last 10 years is the degree to which reacting with an air campaign allows to scratch the immediate itch, I guess is the way that I put it. Let me be clear, this war will not be won without the use of air power. The problem is
Will it be won without the use of boot power?
And I'll get to that in a second. It won't be won without the use of air power. The concern is being fooled that it can be won by the use of air power. And so this is one of the solely, and this is one of the examples that's stressing international law, I think at this stage, is what you choose to bomb may have consequences that are unintended. A lot of this happens in warfare, and you may end up with your own banks being bombed by another state. I mean, this law is being expanded in trying to deal with the type of actors we're dealing with. However, let me give you an example in terms of ISIS itself, or the Islamic State, which is what I prefer to use as well. So there was a narrative that was going on for the last 4 or 5 years with respect to Al-Qaeda. And that was, if you want to be cynical, it was 10 guys sitting in a cave somewhere. And if we just decapitate Al-Qaeda, we would solve the problem. And this was the notion around the drone strike. That met the interests of the coalition and the US in terms of doing something and showing success. It actually met the interests of the human rights community that wanted to look upon Al-Qaeda as simply a terrorist threat. And it's therefore amenable to law enforcement because this is small groups. Another group it potentially met their interests was Al-Qaeda itself. And a Pakistani journalist wrote a book back in 2011 that said that Al-Qaeda will show you what it wants, but it's something different. And the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are not just terrorist groups. These are sophisticated insurgencies capable of governance. They're not legal states, but they are governing entities, and they will not be won without significant action. The question is whether the boots on the ground are foreign or local, which leads to the next slide. And on this, what I lay out is two notions of warfare. And there's been no, in this conference, there has been a discussion of hybrid warfare. This is the new term that we use. But I would suggest that warfare is far more complicated than that, and it always has been, and that is the question of the law enforcement part, the criminal activity related to lawfare. On your left, you see the slide going down. It's a top-down version, the way conventional militaries look at warfare. At the bottom, with the law enforcement portion, arises during occupation, which of course traditionally is very short-term. So you have to both enforce the law and you use conventional forces. On your right is a different notion of armed conflict, and these are the types of armed conflicts that we're engaged in. They're far more complex, and these will not be won by the use of military force alone. They will not be won even primarily by the use of force. They will be won by governance, and they will be won by law enforcement, and they will be won by building the institutions of governance which lead to, as we heard this morning, effective states that are democracies that represent rights. However, these states will not necessarily be in the image of the US government, the Canadian government, the Israeli government, or other governments. These will have to be results that reflect what, in this case, the Syrian people will come up with in terms of the type of government that they can live with and need. And the final point that I would add on this is one of the great dangers that I see in the conflict in Syria is not the Islamic State. They are a top-down type of organization. They rule by fear. They rule by violence. They rule by terror. They are genocidal. This is an evil group. There's another group that equally has the same end state that it wants to have, but it is increasingly working bottom up. It is cooperating with other Islamic groups. It is accepting what it sees as its doctrinal weaknesses. It is seeking to work from the bottom up, which is how you win an insurgency. And that group is al-Nusra, and that group is al-Qaeda. And so in the ultimate battle for winning in Syria, in the ultimate battle in governing the Syrian people, finding a government, the battle is going to be long, it's going to be generational. I have 3 daughters that are in their 20s, and my fear is that their families, their children, will be confronted with trying to deal with the Islamic State or al-Qaeda or other groups like that until we start to focus not on the use of military force, but we start to focus on civil society and start to build on governance to try to address those challenges.
Thank you. That was very enlightening and inspiring. And I think what I would like to echo, with your permission, is the fact that we do need to understand that we're facing something different, and applying military forces and military as an answer, it maybe is an answer for the last war instead of the new challenges that we have. And of course, I think we all agree that it takes time, which brings me to Gal Lusky, who is the founder and CEO of the Israeli Flying Aid, a nonprofit volunteer-based NGO that delivers life-saving aid to communities affected by natural disaster or human conflict. And please excuse me for saving you for the last, but then, of course, I should. World, it is a drop in the bucket. And I'm, Rachel, how are we doing with questions from the audience? Do you have a lot of questions? Okay, so I will hold for a minute for my questions, and we'll take some questions from the audience because we're running out of time. Yeah.
Okay. We have some Canadians in the crowd. So they're asking, there's some concern about the refugees, and I'll read the question. Angela Merkel and Tony Blair once said that multiculturalism has failed. When you bring in thousands, like in Canada, or millions as in Europe, of refugees who value Sharia law and other values, which are incompatible with Western values, at what point do we have to limit immigration, and is it moral to close borders?
You know, Canada is a multicultural society, and I was I was a young law student when when the present Prime Minister's father was bringing in the notion of multiculturalism. And I'm a white Anglo-Saxon cynic on all of this. And I never thought it would work out. And here I am 40 years later, and I think it's absolutely the strength of our country. And my concern about all this is again labeling, one of the concerns I have is how well we know the Muslim community. How many Muslims really want to live under a Sharia law environment? When this Syrian family came in, the first thing our church group did was take them to the local mosque to meet with the local Muslim community. One of the advantages of doing this, and probably one of the most, I think, emotional for many of the people, is the degree to which the Muslim community has embraced, I'm Catholic, has embraced our church, and the degree to which our church has embraced them. And fundamentally, they are people, and they have a God, they have a religion, they are decent, wonderful parents. And I just have trouble accepting that they want anything else different for their family than I want for mine. And at the end of the day, there are exceptions to this. There are questions related to education, but if we exclude, we will never stop conflict. It's got to work the other way, a more inclusive society. And multiculturalism has allowed us to do that. It's been respect for people's differences, but it's also been an acknowledgement that they are different and they bring something positive to our nation. We have tensions like every country. Bringing Syrian refugees to Canada has created some tensions. There has been some negativity. And when the recent announcement came in that they were going to bring another 25,000, the polling initially was very negative. But the polling was negative, not so much the concern, it was a question of how we, even with our rich country, with our wonderful resources, was going to integrate that quickly, that many Syrians into our society.
So that leads to the next question that many, many people in the room asked, which is, but there is a risk. And we know that this is, in some ways, it's been a publicized goal even of the Islamic State to sort of infiltrate their terrorists into Western countries. So how do we screen for that?
There's a risk, but the refugee stream isn't the only way that's being done. So you have to be prepared for that risk in any event. But I mentioned we were no strangers to terrorism. We had an incident in October 2014 where a self-radicalized gunman murdered one of our soldiers at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, went across the street, entered the Parliament, and almost made it into the two rooms at which the opposition and the government were having their meeting. So if we think in terms of the horrific Orlando attack, this had the makings of a similar attack. Our security forces, the police, the master-at-arms, who was a retired police officer, were very aggressive in the way that they reacted to that unexpected threat. We also had another fact, and this is just a fact, and I know this will be a motive with certainly my cousins to our south, was this gunman was armed with an 8-round Winchester rifle, sort of that cowboy kind of old rifle. He wasn't armed with a Sig Sauer MCX weapon. And the result was it was easy for our security forces, courageous security forces, to overwhelm him. If he had an assault weapon, it would have been different. So Canada has chosen, in its society, in its approach to the dangers of violence, to go the gun control route. Other countries will choose whatever they are comfortable with. But all of this is managing risk. Terrorism wants to win by fear. And the time at which we let fear take over how we react, then they are winning and we are losing in terms of values. And I think we saw in Paris, and I think we saw in Brussels, populations standing up. We saw it in New York after 9/11, and we've seen it in Canada after 9/11, in terms of 100,000 Canadians met on Parliament Hill in support of the US and the 23 Canadians that were killed in the World Trade Center. And you see it elsewhere. We can't give in to those fears. We will it's risk management, And in some times, we will lose. But hopefully, we will keep the eye on the ball in the long term and not surrender our values.
I'll ask one more question, and then I'll turn it back over to our moderator for the last 5 or 10 minutes. And this question was directed to Dr. KEDAR, although obviously others can join in. We hear all the time this idea that the vast majority of Muslims are moderate and they're opposed to this. And so the question is, can those people have any significant impact? And what's the best approach for the West to appeal to them to help in this fight that we're all a part of?
Well, no doubt what we witness for years already is actually a struggle inside Islam. When it comes to the relationships with the West, how to view the West, how to view Western values, which we just heard about, because some of them definitely see the West as people who are permissive, people who are materialistic, people who should be toppled. And as you might know, one of the facets of jihad is also hijrah, means immigration. This is one of the manifestations of the battle all over the world, which is aiming at taking the world by immigration. Unfortunately, people here and there do not understand it, and they think that it is nice, it's value, it's nice values, to accept refugees, which is very important, those poor people, poor kids, poor women. Yet, this is how it is viewed from our side, from the Western point of view, while many of those who come first, of course, to find refuge, to find a good place, a roof above their head and good health system, while they are not coming to integrate into the society, to become enclaves, as we see in France today, unfortunately, but this is what happens with multiculturalism, and Germany as well, when we have all kinds of neighborhoods which they are no-go zones for local police. And at the end of the day, those poor refugees turn to something which the societies which so willingly and mercifully accepted them, they turned into something which is something totally different.
So what do you say? I personally must admit it's quite hard for me to hear cynical.
I'm not cynical.
No,
I'm
you
talking
have
about
a cynical
reality.
tone when you talk about those poor refugees. We've just heard from Gal, and I think that we have to agree as lawyers, as human beings, and as the General Brigadier told us, the refugees are the victims in this conflict. None of them, if they could have chosen, most of them, the vast majority, would have stayed in the homeland.
Dana, let me tell you something. If the West was so merciful for those refugees, first of all, the West should have told Turkey, the first one which you send out, we will flatten Istanbul or Ankara together. Keep those people to you because you are responsible.
Oh, flatten Istanbul. Flatten, did you just say flatten
Yes.
Istanbul? Oh, okay.
I mean
So
what
we
I
start
say.
a new world war
Because
in Europe.
Turkey is responsible for what happened in Syria way much more than Canada, United States, Germany, France combined. So Turkey should bear the burden of what Turkey did, first of all. Second thing, how many refugees was Iran suggested to take because of the Iranian role in devastating Syria? How many refugees Saudi Arabia took for the money which they sent to the rebels in Syria? How many refugees?
Would you flee?
How
would
many
you flee
refugees
to Saudi
were forced-
Arabia? Would you flee if you were in danger in Syria? Your family, God forbid. We were under, because as you look at most of the refugees, they're just like us. They're normal people who were living. Would you even dream of fleeing to Saudi Arabia?
Excuse me? Saudi Arabia is one of the best countries in the world as long as you don't drink wine and disseminate pornographic materials.
Women
You know how
can't
much
drive
oil
in
they have
Saudi
over there?
Arabia.
You know how much? Okay, women cannot drive. You know what? My wife doesn't also drive. I'm taking her. Okay? And she enjoys it. Look, not everything which, okay, and she is a free woman and she was born in America. Now, what I mean to say that if good, willing people from Europe and America and Canada as well, if they really wanted to help those poor refugees, they should have forced Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Iran to take millions of those refugees.
Professor Bell, you wanted to react, yes.
I just have one short comment. If the R2P, what we call right to protect, would have been O2P, you had less refugees to deal with from the beginning. So I strongly urge the decision makers to adopt the obligation to protect instead of the right to protect and prevent those thousands and millions of refugees crossing all over.
But instead of this, some countries give billions to the Iranians to continue to cause more refugees in Yemen, for example. So who is responsible for the refugee crisis?
If I may, I'm a little bit saddened by the loss of nuance here. There's a world of possibilities in between closing your heart and closing your eyes. And so it is possible to understand that most of the refugees are in fact victims. Most Muslims in the world are not terrorists. They're not out to kill us. And yet also to be able to understand that the way the groups that are operating in this universe, the way they operate is not by territory, but by ideology. Right? If you compare, I think Ken was talking about the difference between Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State. That's right. Al-Qaeda is these days not very much territorial based. Where it's based in is an ideology. And so when we talk about things like self-radicalization of terrorists in the West, as if they're René Descartes sitting in a room and contemplating the universe, then deciding to kill, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that they are absorbing and carrying out a certain worldview that is being transmitted to them, not by guns, but by suasion. You know, when you analyze a crime scene, you think about means, motive, and opportunity. We have to think not just about means and opportunity, we have to start thinking about motivation. And when you're looking at the vast population movements that are going on in the world, most of these people are victims of the most horrible. Some of them are themselves the most horrible. And the fact that it is difficult to pick these out, and the fact that it's difficult to pick out who of these people that look today like victims are going to tomorrow turn into monsters, doesn't absolve us of the task any more than it absolves of all the other difficult tasks that we have to do when we screen people in airports trying to figure out who is a threat and who is not, when soldiers shoot at people and try to figure out which one is the threat and which one is not. This is the thing that we have to do. It's horrible, horrible work. I agree. It really is horrible, and we make mistakes, and sometimes innocent people get hurt. It's true. That doesn't absolve us of the moral responsibility to try to figure out who these monsters are, and no, they're not self-radicalized. These monsters are created by an environment that is trying to create them. That is the work of organizations like Al-Qaeda.
Mayor HABIB, which brings me to one facet of this multifaceted challenge that we face, and that is the rise of the extreme right in Europe, and the fact that these great challenges and these times of desire and the fact that people are feeling under threat, in a way, is awakening voices that we thought we could have gotten rid of them earlier on. So how do you deal with that, and how concerned are you with the fact that the terror in its way and Al-Qaeda and ISIS in a way will rob us from our morals?
It's a good question, Dana. The problem is today...
He's a politician.
we have... No, but you have to understand.
He just
today,
doesn't want
the
me to
poll-
ask, Meyer HABIB doesn't want me to ask about Mimran, which I really want to ask about. But
concerning,
ask you
you
about
have to
Mimran?
understand that not 30% of people which vote Le Pen in France are not extreme right. If we give a real answer to the, they are not anti-Semite and they are not racist. And unfortunately, they vote Le Pen and it's going on increase. And the poll give today around 25 to 30%. In order to go down the number of extreme right, we have to solve the problem. How to solve the problem? For sure, we have to take refugees. For two, to have to open our heart. But we have, first of all, to solve the problem in those countries. And we don't do that because the world is weak. That's the main problem today. The world is in total silence concerning those problems. And instead, today it's not we are in a war of civilization. It's not a war of territories, like in my opinion in Israel. It's a war of civilization. When you see the President Obama, so they don't want to say terrorism Islamic. They don't want to say that. We already failed, you know, because during years and years, our parents live in Arab countries with Arab people, like brother. Everyone accepts the second one, and it was not exactly the new theory of Islam that they bring today. That's the main problem. And unfortunately, today we have to solve this point at the root of the problem. Unfortunately, when I see a few months ago in Paris, the president of Iran, which invents the terrorism Islamic. I have a dinner with the son of the Shah d'Iran a few weeks ago. And he told me, you are only member of parliament in France who says the truth. But when I see the president of Iran with all the theory where they apply the Sharia, we kill 1,000 of people in Paris, in Italy, in Europe, we silent. We have a problem with that. There is no good and bad Islamic, no good and bad terrorism. We have terrorism, we have to fight terrorism and to finish with terrorism Islamic, because today 99% of the terrorism is coming from Islam. That's the main problem.
Can I ask you, Member of Parliament HABIB, can I ask you about Mimran? Do you want to? No, I'm just, it's just, you were in the headlines, but okay, I will suffice with that. Okay, I think we have to end, and I would like to, if my panelists accept, I would like to give the last word to our guest from abroad and give General Brigadier Kenneth Watkin the final word. And I would want to ask you, do you see this as a fight of civilizations, as Member of Parliament HABIB just mentioned, a fight between civilizations?
No, I don't. And the reason I don't, no, you know, Sun Tzu, the Chinese military philosopher, had a primary principle, and that is to know your enemy. And the problem that we have in the dialogue is that when it's general, you know, the enemy is the Jewish people. The enemy are Muslims. The enemy are Christians. That's a dialogue that just doesn't match in any way the complexity of the world we live in. How many Muslims are there? 1.2, 1.3, 1.62 billion? Of those, there is a small part of Salafi Sunnis, and of the Salafi Sunnis, there's a 1/3 part of that are jihadists. And what I've been trying to, okay, and the Shia, of course, have their also, with respect to what they're, yes, yeah, I understand fully, but the problem becomes when you start to identify as a group characteristics that truly, in terms of statistics, are a small group, and that is ideologically driven within that small group. So one of the books that I can suggest you might read with respect to just the Syrian jihad is a book written by Charles Lister, who works for used to work for Jane's Defense. And he's written a thick book, detailed book of the complexity of just the Syrian jihad, let alone the complexity of the fighting Salafi jihadists and, you know, separate issue with respect to the Shia. The bottom line for me is it is a fight of values, and I cannot see how it's as simple as reciprocity. You know, underpinning all of our religions is the notion of treating others as you would want to be treated. And one of the challenges, and well, let me put it this way: under my religion, that's the notion. And one of the questions that I have trouble.
Just a minute, please.
Right.
I think this is.
Yeah.
I think we should at least. We have someone who flew over, and you know, my husband. When I quarrel with him, I drive. He lets me drive. Can you imagine? I got here in my car, right, women? Where were you when we? Thank you. Yes. Anyway, so I drove here, and I always, when I argue with him, he says, "What you want to say, you already know. If you listen to me, maybe you'll learn something new." And it works. So let's try and listen, open-minded, because we came here for a conference. Let the General Brigadier finish his words kindly and politely, please, because we want him to go back and say that this was a fruitful conference and he could express his thoughts.
Let me put it this way by analogy. We started out, one of the questions that was talking about was, and it came up earlier, you know, the notion of Chief Justice Barak saying that, you know, democracies have to fight with one hand behind their back. And so, you know, we put it in the context of a military, and this, and, you know, in my 33 years in the military, 28 years as a military lawyer, this came up, not often, but it did come up. Why do we have to live under these restrictions? And they're as simple as these restrictions define us and they define our society. So Canada has determined that we will treat people a certain way. And we will treat the victims of conflict as victims regardless of their citizenship, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their race. And what does it say in terms of maintaining our own society within a military if you empower people to do what they want to do and don't want to go against our values? And if you do that, you're empowering them to not only disobey the law, but you're causing your military discipline to fall apart. Because once you say to a subordinate, you can do what you want, I can do what I want, compared to what I've been told, you've empowered them to do what they want. So I guess I'm back to where I am in terms of how you treat other people. If you don't want to be treated as a group, you know, not in terms of the characteristics you bring, I just find it difficult to see how you can treat others that way. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. No, we have to close the panel. We already have the Minister of Education who has just joined us. Hi, Naftali. Will you let your wife drive?
We have to stop.
We have to stop. We have to stop.
We have
I'm
to
sorry.
stop.
I want to
Our next speaker is here.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would just like
Dana.
to thank, Rachel, I would like to
course.
thank the panel, and I would like to thank the audience. I think it was a very interesting discussion, very candid, and I think we all have fruit for thought to go ahead and tackle these ideas. And unfortunately, I have to agree, I think we all agree that next year, and in 5 years, and in 10 years, we can still have the same panel. Hopefully, we will still be here to talk about it. So thank you, and thank you for your time.
Please remain in your seats. Please remain in your seats. We don't want Minister Bennett's security to have to remove anybody. Okay, I thank very much this panel. I think this has been a very exciting discussion, and I am so happy that all of you are here to join us. Thank you so very much. And thank you to our amazing moderator, Dana. You are great.